Anyway, let's thank you for coming. Hopefully you're enjoying the studies. I know I enjoyed preparing mine and enjoyed Malcolm's first one, and I'm really enjoying the Bible Project videos. Actually, they're really good. Isn't it good that they make some videos just for us?
Even with the same name.
So, we're continuing on through the series up to poetry, psalms, wisdom, literature today. One of the things I want to keep back in your mind is as you're learning and sort of integrating all this together, one of Malcolm and Stephen's hopes is that through this sort of 10 weeks, you feel you've got a really good foundation of how to interpret. And we thought that would be a good stepping stone maybe for some practice sermons to be done at Renew in the coming months in term 3 and 4. So that's part of, hopefully, at the end of this, you feel you might want to put your hand up and give a sermon or two. And when you get given a passage, you'll be able to feel you've got the tools to try to interpret it and bring out the message through a sermon. Because I think week 8 is going to be about how to prepare a sermon week. Yeah. So that's coming. Yep. But anyway, I'll hand over to Malcolm now.
Yep.
Oh, let's pray first, actually. Do you want to pray for us, Mel?
Sure.
Thanks.
Holy Father, thank you for letting us come to Graham's house today and learn your word, God. Thank you for your protection. Thank you for the prayers, God, that you answer for us, Lord. You know those prayers are on our hearts, God, and you know what we're going to ask you before we even ask you. And whether it takes time for that to happen, God, or you answer those immediately, the love that you give us, God, and show us is just tremendous, God. Thank you for letting us learn your word, Holy Father. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Okay. Well, as you
Can I just ask, does anybody have a stapler?
Why don't you just go with stapled one?
I might have one in my wallet.
Shalanda's elbow.
Have a stapler too.
Yeah, Shalanda has a stapler.
She won't have organised it yet.
Mine's done.
I'm good.
Yeah. It's just me.
As you probably remember, we've been talking about the different genres in the Bible, and the Bible Project talk about 3 basic genres. One is narrative, one is poetry, and one is prose discourse. Now in this section I'm going to occasionally contrast poetry with prose, because narrative and prose discourse are both prose. So prose is divided up into, in the Bible Project guys, they divide it into 2 categories. And in literature, you can say there's poetry and prose. And actually, you'll notice that I've only got Job's, Psalms, Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes in here. There are actually lots of other poetic books in the Bible, such as Lamentations, Joel, and we'll actually look at them in a slide. We'll see how much poetry there is in the Bible, but I'm not going to be talking about prophetic poetry because we're doing the prophets next week. The poetic principles will be the same, but the way that you interpret them is a little bit different because of the subject matter. And the structure of tonight is we'll start with poetry in general and then get into the more specific forms of it, which in this case is mostly these books, because they have different categories.
You carry on. I've left my Bible on the car.
Yep.
I'm going to go and get it.
Okay.
Do I need it?
I'm sure Graham has a Bible.
Yeah. We will be looking at the Bible. Actually, I left Proverbs off there, so I just noticed an error on that slide. I missed Proverbs, so that should be on there as well.
I was going to say.
We're covering Proverbs. So, the first question, of course, is poetry important, or why is it important? Why is it a whole separate category? It's not very important in everyday life, although you do learn it in high school. But I didn't do a poetry subject in my engineering degree, so how come we do it in Bible study? well, we already know that poetry is 30% of the Bible, right? And in fact, you don't have to get very far into the Bible before you hit the first bit of poetry. The 27th verse is poetry in the first chapter of the Bible. So you're not very far in at all. You've spent a few seconds reading, depending on how fast a reader you are, and you hit the first bit of poetry. And this shows all of the characteristics of Hebrew poetry, which we'll talk about. So this is typical poetry. And in your English Bibles, post KJV, it's always going to be formatted like poetry, just like this, so that you can see at a glance that you've suddenly hit a bit of poetry. Now, this is a map of poetry in the Old Testament. What we've got here is books in the genre that the book belongs in because of its topic matter. And then we've got color code. So the red stuff, and of course poetry over here, the red stuff is primarily poetry, like almost all poetry, with only a few chapters of prose, maybe an introduction or something. And you can see that all of the wisdom literature in the middle of our Bibles is poetry, and but there's also a lot of prophets that are almost entirely poetry, like Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, Micah, Joel, Malachi, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk, Nahum, and Obadiah. These are all varying degrees of poetry, but well over half poetry. Some of them are entirely poetry. Things like, I think, Joel and books like that. Then the next category is partially poetry, and that's books that have several chapters of poetry, ranging from quite a few chapters to just one or two, but more than just a few lines. And that includes everything from Genesis, we saw that its 27th verse is already getting into poetry, through to Jeremiah, which has a lot of poetry. There's a lot of poetic prophecies or oracles in Jeremiah. Even things like history, like Samuel and Chronicles, have a few chapters of poetry. Samuel has a few of David's psalms in it and things like that. And then we've got little poetry, which is where it's just a few lines scattered here and there. And there's only one book in the whole Old Testament that has no poetry at all. And it's also the book that has no mention of God. So it's a very unusual book and quite out of character. So that gives you an idea of how much poetry is just it's just omnipresent, and Jewish literature is not unusual in this. All ancient literature is like this. Poetry is a very common genre in ancient literature. If you read the Iluma, Elish, and all of these ancient stories and stuff, they tend to be in poetic form. There's lots of almost all of the stories that I can think of offhand in ancient literature are poetic. It's only things like conquest lists and stuff like that aren't in poetry. So poetry is a very powerful tool for humanity, and it's only become less popular as we've become more literate in a way, as literature has replaced other forms of communication, I guess, since the printing press, and we've used literature. We have things like user guides instead of just master apprentices.
Could it be because it's easier to remember a song than what it is?
It's easier to remember. It's more potent in what it conveys. It uses words more efficiently, so it says more in a shorter space, and all of those things are important when you're a semi-literate society. so poetry is really important. I mean, in an oral society, almost all that they have is poetry. So that's why the Aboriginals have their song lines. They don't have prose lines; they have song lines. So I think in an oral society, it's almost entirely poetry. So that's because it's easy to remember and easy to pass through, and it's sort of got built-in error correction. If you accidentally add a word into poetry,
Wrap it up.
yeah, that's right. Now, Hebrew poetry is a particular thing. Just as we have different styles of poetry in English, and English poetry is very different to Russian poetry, etc. Hebrew poetry is its own thing. So how do you tell what Hebrew poetry is? Okay, this
It's in
is
Hebrew.
yeah. I don't know why this takes so long, but it's going to a video. It's actually the PowerPoint. It's slow for some reason. Yep, there we go. So this video from the Bible Project introduces us to ideas of Hebrew poetry. So let's watch this.